We always, at Earlham, start events like this with a few moments of silence, but tonight of all nights, it seems particularly important. Will you join me for a few moments of worshipful preparation? Good evening. Welcome to a day of focus, focusing on September 11th and beyond. For the next 27 hours, we're going to talk about the origins of hatred and the roots of war. We're going to also talk about the possibilities of reconciliation and the conditions we need to establish for security and peace. If you'll forgive a lighthearted moment, thinking about what else is going on this evening, I think looking out at this audience, we can see who the real men are in Richmond, Indiana. They're those who know how to program their VCRs. Nearly 5 months ago, Earlham, Richmond, the United States, the entire world community were staggered by acts of violence that were as horrifying as they were unexpected. A few weeks later, the United States began military action against Afghanistan for harboring Osama bin Laden and the al-Qaeda network. The Taliban regime in Afghanistan has now fallen, and a manhunt continues for Taliban leaders and Osama bin Laden. This past week, in his State of the Union address, President George Bush gave us some hints, but only hints about what comes next in talking about an axis of evil. We are still trying, all of us, to make sense of September 11th and its aftermath. In the weeks and months since that day, we have all found ourselves wondering, how did this happen? What can we do to regain a sense of safety and security? How can we pursue justice and peace in this world? We have, I think, all of us, questions about terrorism. We have questions about U.S. foreign policy, its goals and its means. We have questions about a part of the world we in the United States don't know very well for the most part. We have questions about Islam. And whatever our religious beliefs, we have questions about what is the right thing to do now as individuals and as citizens of the world, citizens of the United States and as members of a world community. We've organized this day of focus to give us opportunities to deepen our understandings, to weigh these opportunities, and to seek answers with one another. I hope you all have a schedule in front of you of the events that will go on tomorrow, starting at noontime, and some other things I think are happening around campus as well. And perhaps we'll have a chance to talk about them later after the speech. But now it's my very great privilege to introduce to you Landrum Bolling. For many, many decades, Landrum Bolling has been helping us understand the roots of war and the possibilities of peace in the Middle East and around the world. Many of you know Landrum well, but here's just a few biographical notes for those of you who are newcomers to Landrum Bolling. He received his BA from the University of Tennessee and his master's degree in political science from the University of Chicago. In the years following, he was a teacher and a journalist, sometimes both together. He taught at Beloit College, worked for the local newspaper in Beloit, and he worked as a journalist during World War II in the Balkans, in Italy, and in Berlin. In 1948, he came to Earlham. And was a member of the faculty for 10 years and became president in 1958, serving as president until 1973. While at Earlham, even as president, he did a number of things to broaden Earlham's interest in international things. He worked with Jackson Bailey to found the Japan Studies program. He helped strengthen schools in Kenya. He worked with the American Friends Service Committee, leading a study group that produced a very important work, especially for American audiences, called Search for Peace in the Middle East, giving a more balanced sense of the nature of that conflict. After Earlham, after 1973, Landrum served as president and board chair in succession for Lilly Endowment. He served as head of the Council on Foundations in New York City. And for a time, he served as president and rector of the Ecumenical Institute in Jerusalem. For the last 30 years, Landrum has been one of the world's most respected and certainly energetic practitioners of citizen diplomacy. He has been an activist for peace and reconciliation. He's won the trust of many leaders on both sides of a number of world conflicts and served often to facilitate dialogue among people who are officially not talking to one another. Currently, he is Director at Large of Mercy Corps and Senior Fellow of the Center for International Policy in Washington, D.C. I understand Landrum is writing a book called something like Peace Options for the Middle East After the Gulf War. I'm looking forward to reading that book, but I'm especially grateful he's here with us this evening to help us deepen our understandings of September 11th and its aftermath. Will you join me in welcoming Landrum Bolling?
Thank you, Doug. Dear friends, former colleagues, former students, Earlhamites, fellow Quakers, and all you loyal Indianapolis Colts fans. I'd just like to make a little typographical correction in the announcement sheet that was handed out to you. There was a little bit of miscommunication between me and the college and the printer, I guess. The title I thought I was going to speak under was Terrorism, Religion, and Politics as Usual. It came out Terrorism, Politics, and Religion as Usual. And I didn't protest. I said, maybe that's the better title after all. In any case, I want to speak in that sequence. And forgive me if I start with a little bit of philosophical background here. It seems to me that the most overworked cliche, the most taken for granted piece of conventional political wisdom about the overwhelming fears and troubles with which this country and so much of the world have been trying to cope in recent months is this, and you hear it everywhere. Everything has changed since September 11. That, I believe, is an exceedingly misleading judgment. What is truly amazing is how little things have changed. What is most frightening is how little we seem to have learned so far of the lessons we ought to be learning from the horrors of those suicide bomber experiences. We are only in the beginning stages of trying to determine what kind of people have been doing these terrible things and how they got that way, what their motivations were and are, what they hope to accomplish, and what, if anything, we can do to change their bad attitudes and destructive behavior. We must not miss the opportunity to find honest answers to these and many other questions that must be addressed if we're to have any realistic means for understanding what the terrorism business is all about and what we can and should do to bring it to a tolerable ending. However strong a case can be made for fighting and winning the war we have fought in Afghanistan, American smart bombs will never stop terrorism. In urging that we seek earnestly to understand the actions of the people with whom we are having our angry, violent confrontation, let me be clear, I am not asking that we find excuses or justification for them. There is no way through any political ideology or system of ethics or religious doctrine to justify the wanton random killing of several thousand innocent people at the World Trade Towers, at the Pentagon, and in the peaceful Pennsylvania countryside. Those murders were bloody crimes, and twisting the words of the Quran or any of the other teachings of faithful, responsible followers of Islam can never provide a credible blessing for such evils. On the contrary, the world community of nations and peoples and religions have an inescapable obligation to work together to stop such madness that threatens all peoples and all religions. The struggle against bin Laden and his network is not the clash of two opposing civilizations, as some people have tried to put it. His is a sick, malevolent, crusading war against all civilizations by half-educated, technically skilled, morally deformed, piously perverted zealots who are trying to hijack one of the great religions of the world. They must be stopped, and vast numbers of young people who have fallen under influence must be helped to acquire an education and a moral grounding that will lead them away from such diabolical doctrines. But merely denouncing Muslim zealots, however, is not enough. Killing or capturing their fighters is not enough. Broadening the so-called war on terrorism to include military action against other nations now lumped together in this so-called evil axis. Such an expanded military action, even if successful, would not be enough. On one central issue, President Bush is certainly right. This struggle will not be finished quickly or easily or cheaply. We may well be living with various aspects and stages and venues of this struggle for a long, long time to come. Let us, we pray, be sure that we know what we are doing. We must define the problems as precisely, as accurately, as objectively, as comprehensively as is humanly possible to do. This is a big, big challenge we face. It's a big problem we've got to put our minds to. We must be clear about the symptoms of this terrible sickness. We must probe deeply to determine all the possible sources of this infection and try to arrive at the right diagnosis. Then we must plan, acquire the necessary resources, develop a comprehensive program of treatment and rehabilitation, and stay with it until some significant measure of cure has been attained. Crucial to that whole process, to be sure, is that our government leaders and the political leaders from a few other countries allied with us should finish the job of capturing and interrogating Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters. No doubt much useful information is being gleaned that will provide essential information on symptoms and causes that must be understood in devising the most appropriate treatment and in preventing other similar acts of senseless violence from being committed. Understandably, there's a great desire to bring some form of just punishment to bear upon those responsible for the planning and execution of these horrible deeds, and to serve as a warning to others who may be tempted to go and do likewise. Yet it has been of high importance that the United States did not rush immediately into angry reprisals, as some people counseled, but with some degree of slowness and deliberation prepared a measured response. Moreover, it has been essential that we get over the notion that capturing or killing Osama bin Laden would somehow solve the terrorism problem. It will not. A war to destroy the Taliban government and its military machine and to root out the training camps and fighting units of Osama bin Laden's fanatical movement was to have been expected. Within the pattern of military operations, it seems to have been highly successful so far. In consequence, President George W. Bush's approval rating has risen higher than that of any other American leader whose popularity has been tested. Yet we will never know for sure whether other options might have worked as well or better. What we do know is that even successful wars are bought at a heavy price. As we move along, we have to be thoroughly honest with ourselves and with the world, our critics and our allies, about the true costs of our success and about the extraordinary means we use to win. Make no mistake about it, This has been an American-designed war, an American-run war, an awesome, overpowering American victory with almost no American combat casualties. The local warlords provided the fighters on the ground, who suffered practically all of the casualties. Our highly trained, high-tech special forces gave them combat guidance and relayed the essential intelligence to our far-distant control centers that sent out the missiles and the bombers to inflict their incredibly accurate devastation on the chosen targets, with, of course, some misses, as always happens. And one of the obscene terms we use about this is collateral damage. We kill a lot of innocent people when bombs go astray, as they do. This war that we have now fought is Star Wars of the future, now upon us. It's made in America. Unfortunately, our very success becomes a confirming, expanding part of our overall problem, the American image. Almost everywhere around the world, by many thoughtful people, we are seen as the unchallengeable, only superpower in the whole world, and many call us an arrogant bully. Even our closest friends and allies are a bit frightened by us. They recognize our dominance on the world stage and basically accept that reality, but it makes them uncomfortable. They are not sure they really trust us all the way. There are things our leaders do and say that again and again impel the leaders of other countries, including our allies and best friends, to conclude that the Americans on most issues are determined to have their own way, regardless of what other countries think. Whether it's environmental protection or trade agreements or missile defense or peacekeeping in the Balkans or peacemaking in the Middle East, or adherence to the rules of the World Court, or the decisions of the UN Security Council, or the handling of detainees from the Afghan war in Guantanamo, the United States insists on calling the shots and expects everybody else to fall in line. Naturally, we resent and resist these criticisms. From our side, we accuse the Europeans, including our partners in NATO, of being indecisive, soft-headed, disorganized, too much obsessed with their own individual national interests to take effective action in times of international crisis. We like to have their moral, political, and financial support wherever possible, but we don't want them interfering in our operations. We believe in a centralized command with us in command. I'm not saying this is good or bad. It is simply a reality. Incidentally, I advise you to read Tom Friedman's op-ed column in today's New York Times, reflecting on his experiences on a recent visit to the war zone of Afghanistan and awed by the super sophisticated weaponry the American military have developed and now used. He concludes, in effect, that NATO is virtually finished. America doesn't need it anymore. No country on earth can come anywhere near being a credible partner with us. They can't afford or are unwilling to spend what would be required to become a true fighting partner in the kind of war the United States has shown it is capable of fighting in Kosovo and now in Afghanistan. Friedman points out that the just now proposed military budget for the United States is greater than all of the next 15 highest countries combined. This is a staggering fact about the money we're putting into the military operation. What does all this have to do with terrorism issues we're discussing this week? A lot, I submit. We are talking about the background setting for bin Laden's war against America and America's war on terrorism. The United States is the richest, most powerful, most heavily militarized country on earth, with an economy whose ups and downs affect the lives of billions of people who will never see our shores, and millions who will invest all of their savings and risk their lives to come here, legally or illegally. Almost the whole world, in varying degrees, has a love-hate relationship with the USA. We are admired and despised. We are imitated and disdained. We are envied and resented. I suppose that even in the best of all possible worlds, with the best behavior that we are capable, any nation would be capable of, such a large, rich, diverse, and powerful nation as ours must inevitably invite a kind of mixed reaction from the rest of the world. But that sort of explanation does not do very much to answer the question so often asked since September 11th. Why do they hate us so much? Why particularly do the Muslims hate us so much? There are a number of specific answers that can be made and need to be examined. First of all, let's be clear about it, not all Muslims do hate us. Consider the large number of Muslims from many countries who have emigrated here and have settled happily into life as American citizens and practice their religion, for the most part, free of any disturbance. Think of the students who come here from Muslim countries every year. And think of the warm hospitality, and I'm particularly concerned about this myself because I've experienced it. Think of the warm hospitality that Muslims shower on their foreign guests, including their many American visitors. One thing is clear, you cannot generalize about people. One of the things that I learned years ago in trying to examine the problems of the Arabs and the Israelis, people would tell me, well, the Israelis are like this, the Israelis do this, the Israelis think this. And the same thing would be said about the Arabs. Well, the Arabs are all this, and they're that, and they're something else. And as I became really deeply acquainted with many Israelis and many Arabs, I would have to say, which Israelis are you talking about? Which Arabs are you talking about? There are all kinds of Israelis. There are all kinds of Jews. There are all kinds of Arabs. There are all kinds of Muslims. And they have many, many different views and attitudes and feelings toward the world, toward their neighbors, toward themselves, and many different attitudes toward the United States. So be careful when people try to tell you that this is the way the Muslims are, this is the way they think. They all hate us. That isn't true. But a great many of them do hate us. What is the case that those Muslims who dislike the United States say they have against us? Let me just try to list several of the major factors as I've encountered them in my own discussions with Muslims over the years. Many Muslims, again, I don't say all of them, feel that the Christians and Jewish religious people are deep enemies of Islam. They go back in their recounting of history to remember the Crusades. Most of us don't remember the Crusades, and we've never studied much about them. But that part of the history of Muslims that deals with the Crusades is very vivid in their perception of their history. We have to think about this. One of the darkest chapters in the whole history of Christianity is the history of those Crusades. And the first crusade began, interestingly enough, with a massacre of Jews in the Rhineland as the Christians prepared themselves to go across southern Europe and into the Middle East to rescue the holy places of Christianity from the infidel Muslims. And they fought their way into that area. They got to Jerusalem. And what was the first thing they did when they got to Jerusalem? They killed practically every Jew and every Muslim in the place. This is part of our Christian history. This is part of the Muslims' history of their relations with Christians. When George Bush used the word crusade inadvertently in one of his early speeches, there was a great scream about this, and many people immediately rushed to advise him, please don't use that word again. That's a no, no, no. Well, there's still Muslims out there who think that the Christians are still engaged in some kind of crusade against them. That's wrong. There's no such crusade exists. But they have the feeling that their religion does not carry the kind of respect from other religions that they think they accord to others. One of the things that surprised me when I first began to get acquainted with Muslims in the Middle East, and I went to the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. Inscribed in Arabic around the rim of the Dome of the Rock is a passage from the Quran that speaks of Jesus. I don't remember exactly what the translation is, but the Muslims will say, we have respect for Judaism, we have respect for Christianity, we are heirs to the Jewish and Christian tradition. We have the same ancestral saints that you have, but you don't respect our interpretation of that tradition. And indeed, I think that's true. By and large, we have not shown any great respect for that, for their lifestyle, their beliefs, and their religion. Another part of the case that the Muslims make against the Western world is they accuse us of subverting the morals, corrupting the youth through our lifestyle, and particularly through our popular media. They are outraged at what we deliver to them in the form of television, Hollywood movies, and popular music. They say, is this is your American culture? This is what you have to offer us? And one would have to say that some of the products of Hollywood, some of the products of our television, some of the products of our music composer, performer industry are not best inclined to develop high moral standards and values. They look upon the West as being morally degenerate, as forcing onto the world for commercial purposes our own cheapened moral standards. They look upon America particularly as morally decadent, obsessed with sex, alcohol, and drugs. Now it happens, of course, that a big part of the drug supply of the world comes out of the Middle East. Much of it comes out of Afghanistan. Much of it comes from Muslims. But they have a point. The biggest consumer of these illicit drugs in the world are in the United States of America. They hold this against us, of course, and they call us hypocrites for a double standard of trying to force them to stop the drug production while our consumption goes higher and higher. Further, the Muslims look upon the Western world as the source of unrelenting pressure on Muslim peoples and Muslim countries. One of the things that they point to is what they consider the mistreatment of Muslim guest workers in Europe. In France, there are 2 or 3 million Muslim immigrants or guest workers from North Africa, particularly from the former French colonies there. In Germany, for several years now, 25, 30 years, there's been a very substantial group of Muslim workers from Turkey. And this is true of other countries. They feel that the guest workers in Europe are exploited, mistreated, treated as second-class people. One can never get a full, clear picture of what the realities are about this. In some respects, of course, the guest workers are able to make more money than they ever could make at home, to reach a standard of living they never enjoyed before. Many of them save their money and go back home, able to have a much better life than they ever could have had. But on the other hand, many of them are very unhappy and feel put down and disabused and abused by the treatment they receive. The Muslim world also complains about what they consider as unfair treatment by the West toward certain Muslim countries, Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, and most of all the Palestinians. This is not the place to debate what the right Western and American policy should be toward Iran and Iraq. We've had serious disputes with those two countries. We feel they've been very wrong in their behavior toward us, and we're still trying to punish Iran and Iraq. I don't know what the answer is to Iraq, because Saddam Hussein is undoubtedly, indisputably, one of the most vicious tyrants that ever ruled any country in the world. He learned the worst lessons from Stalin and the worst lessons from Hitler and combined the two lessons to make one of the most oppressive regimes on earth. That's a fact. He operates through an overlaying series of secret police services, 12 or so in number, and torture is very common in his maintaining control of that country. We don't know what to do about Iraq. It's a problem for us. With Iran, there seems to be more hope, because inside Iran today there is a serious reform movement trying to break forth. They have had free elections, honest elections, and those elections produced a 70% majority in favor of the reformers and against the hardline old guard Ayatollahs who are trying to maintain a repressive regime in Iran. But because of a very peculiar constitutional system that the Ayatollah Khomeini set up when he was in power, there is a guardian council, a small group of men, older members of the Muslim hierarchy, who squelch the reform movement in various ways, particularly by their control of the courts and their influence within the military. But inside that country, as I was able to see for myself about a year ago when I was there is a very active uprising of people trying to change things. And in the forefront of this movement for reform are the women of Iran. They are an amazing group of people. The women are not going to put up with these controls forever. And they're very active in various professions. One interesting aspect of that is Iranian women are among the stars in the quite impressive Iranian film industry. They are writing and producing extraordinary films, movies, in Iran, partly because the government's clamped down and wouldn't allow the importation of Hollywood products. So the local producers had a chance, and the women saw the chance to get involved in that, and they're doing something with it. We ought not to just lump Iran in with North Korea and Iraq as a part of an evil axis. I mean, I must say I winced when I heard this comment from President Bush and this very simplistic way of dealing with those three countries. We ought to be doing everything we can to reassure Iran that we want to mend fences with them. We want to get into good, honest dealings with them. We want to help support the right kind of relationships. In my own experience with them, I found the people that I dealt with there forthcoming, open, and I'm glad to say that just in the last few weeks, the mission that I went on to try to negotiate arrangements for my organization, Mercy Corps, to start a program to aid Afghan refugees inside Iran, that now is underway. Just another footnote on this. Iran is the country that has had more refugees deposited on its soil than any other country in the world. At the height, they had about 5 million refugees in Iran. They have today still about 1.5 million Afghan refugees. Most of the Kurdish refugees have gone home. Most of the Marsh Arabs have gone home. Most of the Shiite Iraqis have gone home. But they still have about 1.5 million Afghans. And as I got around the country and saw some of these refugees, visited them in their businesses and their homes and so on, and some of the school programs set up for them, I was impressed with the extraordinary humane character of the Iranian handling of the refugees. They are mostly integrated into the local economy, find housing within the local stock of housing. Very, very few of them are segregated into what are in effect concentration camps in so many places in the world. So many countries don't know how to deal with refugees except to put them in camps. The Iranians have done a much better job than that. So if they have those kinds of qualities that I've seen exhibited in this way, don't tell me that these are all bad people and that we can't find ways to work with them and we can't build something on the relationships we could have. The Palestinian issue is, of course, a very special one. For most Arabs and for most Muslims, the treatment of the Palestinians is the litmus test for them about whether your country is a decent, humane, just country. I have not met in my life a single Arab, a single Muslim, who does not feel that the United States is terribly biased against the Palestinians and blindly supportive of Israel and whatever Israel wants. Now, this is overstated. It is perhaps exaggerated in a variety of ways, but this is the way they see it. This is the way they feel. This is the way they know the Palestinians feel. My own feeling is that the thing that could be done that would help to ease the conflict feelings that produce this terrorism more than anything else would be for the United States to adopt a truly even-handed policy toward the Palestinians and Israelis and use our influence to the full to put an end to this madness that's going on in the so-called Holy Land. I've just come back from a visit there last week, and though things are grim and Ramallah is a besieged town and the Israelis have tanks around Arafat's headquarters and going back and forth is a nightmare, still the people of Ramallah hang on and they do not give up, and they still believe that there is a possibility for peace down the road. And I believe that too. There is a possibility for peace. And we, the United States, have a greater opportunity to influence a decision for peace than any other power on earth. No mistake about that whatever. It's only a question of whether we have the will to do what we have the power to do to try to change the situation. But so long as the Palestinians are in the desperate straits they are in, persecuted, abused in all sorts of ways, the Muslim world, the Arab world, will continue to hate us. They blame us more than anybody else for the plight of the Palestinians. Another part of the Muslim case against the Western world is that the Western world dominates the economic life of their countries. As they see it, exploits their natural resources and treats them unfairly in trade relations. There again, you can have many arguments. Often, trading partners disagree about how the other side behaves. But there is a feeling by people who are weak and relatively poor that the powerful and rich on the other side are taking advantage of them. But all of this, of course, is not really explaining why Osama bin Laden and his people did the terrible things they did, though the Palestinian issue is one that they've tried to hijack. Let me say just a word about this. At the time of the Gulf War, at the time of our great conflict with Saddam Hussein and Iraq, he tried to inject the Palestine issue into the conflict. And you remember for a time he launched Scud missiles against Palestine and said, "I'm fighting a war to liberate the Palestinians." He had never shown any real interest in the Palestinians up to that point, but being a good, wily politician, he saw an opening there, and he tried to hijack the Palestinian issue to his own advantage. It didn't work. The same thing is true of Osama bin Laden. There's no indication that over his last 25 years of adult activity, he's done anything particularly to help the Palestinians. But now, all of a sudden, in the midst of this conflict, which he precipitated, He speaks out, he's been speaking out again and again about how he's fighting the battle of the Palestinians. So be careful of those who claim to take over that issue. That is one of the issues that bin Laden uses against us. But if you want to get to the bottom of bin Laden's case against the United States and the West, I think it is simply this. He blames the West, and particularly the United States, for keeping in power the Saudi family government in his home country, a government that he labels, and so do many others, as corrupt, incompetent, oppressive, socially insensitive. It is no accident that the overwhelming majority of the participants in the bombing suicide missions were Saudis from Saudi Arabia, young men brought up in that country, in that culture, under that government. There's no accident that the next largest group of these people were Egyptian. To a great many Egyptians, the Egyptian government is corrupt, incompetent, and almost beneath contempt. These are unpopular governments. The Saudi government and the Egyptian government have very strong enemies within their own ranks. Now, most Egyptians and most Saudis do not want to carry their opposition down the terrible, bloody road that Osama bin Laden and his people have traveled. But the fact is that it is within this context of disappointment, resentment, anger, bitterness, hatred against their own ruling class that these terrorists have gained the foothold they have gained. Well, what is America to do with this? Well, as they see it, and this I think is distortion, they see the maintenance of those governments as being totally dependent on the backing of the United States. The Saudi opposition will tell you, if it weren't for the close ties that the United States government and the United States business community have with Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Arabian government, this government would fall. They couldn't possibly survive. Who would take their place? This is a frightening thought. One of the troubles is that over the years, we in the West, we Americans, have been in a state of denial about the nature of the governments with which we have made such strong alliances. Now, it's a very tricky thing for any government, any power, particularly a great power, to intervene in the internal political, social affairs of another country. But the fact is that we have done precious little to advance the cause of democracy and human rights in any of these Arab countries. And as seen by a large percentage of their own population, these governments are corrupt, dishonest, oppressive, irresponsible, socially insensitive, and the only forces that stand against those governments of any significance are the religious Muslim activists. Call them fundamentalists or extremists or whatever you will, and there are many different kinds of people among them. There is a very, very wide-held belief that these governments have to go, and in time will go. I remember I went into Amman just after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and the Americans came in and drove them back. I met for one very interesting day at a nice leisurely lunch with a businessman friend of mine, Western educated, pro-democratic, a man whose family I've known for many years. And I asked him what he thought about what had happened in Kuwait. He said, I think it was terrific what Saddam Hussein did. The only trouble was he should have kept going. He should have gone on down into Saudi Arabia and swept that incompetent family out of power. I said, come on, what are you talking about? How can you say things like that? He said, these governments won't last. These governments don't belong there. Sooner or later, they're going to be swept out. I'm not in favor of Saddam Hussein. He's a terrible man. He runs a terrible government. But he was undertaking to drive these people out of power, and it should have been done. I'm just sorry that he stopped where he did. Well, I still don't quite get my mind to handle that particular analysis. But that a Western-oriented, prosperous, upper-middle class, democratically spirited person would have that evaluation of Saddam Hussein blows my mind. But he was not unusual. There are a great many other people who shared that view. I don't know what we do about this. I don't know how we can help, but I do feel that one of the unresolved missions that we have got to be thinking about is how can we be supportive of the elements struggling to find a way toward democracy, human rights, justice, rule of law in those lands that are ruled by oppressive and incompetent governments. The most hated word in Arabic, in my experience, is the word muhabarat, which means secret police. All of these governments, including the most moderate of them all, Jordan, depend for their success, for their stability, for their control, upon a ruthless secret police. Much as I liked and admired King Hussein, who I got to know over a period of 30 years very well, sat at his table many a time, liked the man, he was a charming, delightful person. But he was, in a sense, the prisoner of his own secret police. He once threw a friend of mine in jail, took away his passport, wouldn't let him travel, because somebody carried some charge against him to the secret police, and the secret police were a law unto themselves. Finally, the king got word of this and let the man go. But this is typical of what happens through all of these Arab countries. The muhabarat is the ultimate power. Saddam Hussein is himself the ultimate dictator, the ultimate manipulator of secret police. Somehow we have got to address this issue of where are these governments going and what can we do to help make a different kind of political social system in that part of the world. Now I want to finish with just a word about politics as usual and how we might get out of politics as usual. Part of our politics as usual toward the Middle East, toward the Arab world, toward the Muslim world is that our government will support any Arab government that's able to maintain stability at home, stay out of wars, and assure the United States of full access to their oil supplies. Our policy toward the Gulf states, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, Dubai, the rest of them, no question about it, is dominated by our concern to have access to, we might say, control of our supply of oil. That's understandable, but it's not an adequate basis for a sound and effective foreign policy in that region. Another part of our politics, as usual, is that we must support Israel in every way that Israel wants our support. We will regard it as our democratic ally, the only democratic country in the region, a country that is Western-oriented, that believes in the rule of law, that has free elections, that has an honest court system, and so on. On this country, we have bestowed the most generous allocation of our foreign aid in all the world. Israel has an annual family income today of about $17,000, $18,000 a year. It's a prosperous country. Still to this day, they receive the largest allocation of our foreign aid of any country in the world, far outstripping many far larger, far more impoverished countries that are on the very ragged edge of existence. But we load up our gifts to Israel year after year. We give them our best military equipment, and we wink at the fact that they have the atom bomb. We are making a great thing about the great danger that Iran may get the atom bomb, that Saddam Hussein is trying to get the atom bomb, that Pakistan now has the atom bomb, that it's a terrible thing for these other countries to have the atom bomb. That violates the non-proliferation agreement. Israel has had the atom bomb for 20 years. They've got perhaps at least a stockpile of at least 200 of them. Do we say anything about that? No, not a thing. Not a thing. You can imagine what Muslims, Arabs say about it. We are facing a very serious set of choices right now with regard to the Israeli-Palestinian relationship. So far, Mr. Bush has refused to have anything to do with Arafat. He will not receive him in the White House. He will not talk to him. And we have indicated that we think he's irrelevant and must go. I had a visit the other day in Tel Aviv with our American ambassador there, a man I've known for many years, a wonderful, fine person, an Orthodox Jew, who's handling his mission with great objectivity and fairness. I asked him about the relationship between Arafat and Sharon. He said one of the big troubles is these two men hate each other personally, and Sharon particularly is determined to destroy Yasser Arafat. In 1982, Sharon, as a defense minister, invaded Lebanon in order to destroy Arafat. He didn't get the job done, and in the course of his military adventure, he disgraced his country with the Sabra Shatila massacres, was made the subject of a very sweeping critical examination of his policies, and he had to resign from the government in those days. Today he rules over the Israeli government as its prime minister. The problem of the Palestinian-Israeli quarrel will not be settled by destroying Yasser Arafat, nor will it be destroyed by evicting Sharon from his office. There is a way to do it. It can be done. The question is, do we have the will to intervene in ways that will be seen as fair and objective and practical and get it done? One of the things that came through again to me in this past week when I was in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and Ramallah and Bethlehem and even in that besieged town of Tulkarm up on the border, in spite of the terrible things that are going on there, there is a will on the part of ordinary people everywhere and also on the part of many of the officials on both sides to get this over with. We don't need this anymore. We've had enough of this. There is a way toward peace. We've got to be supportive of that. If we really prove ourselves to be supportive of a genuine peace in that region, it will enormously improve the chance that we will deal effectively with the terrorism issue. The final thing I want to say is that I believe that we need, in terms of our long-range foreign policy planning, to develop a bold program of economic and social assistance to the Arab and Muslim countries and to other developing countries in other parts of the world. Many of the peoples of the world are today living on the very ragged edge of starvation. There are many, many, many millions of poor people in the world today. In countries where more and more people are getting at least some education, and as they get educated, they become more and more dissatisfied with their lot. I don't say that we can solve all their problems. I don't say that we will ever be rich enough to buy them the kind of life they want. They will have to earn it themselves, but they can be helped. And one of the things that we most need to do is to help develop, to improve, to enlarge, to expand the educational resources they have. One of the reasons for the terrorism that exists in the Afghan-Pakistan area is the existence of more than 7,000 madrasa religious schools in northern Pakistan, financed by the Saudis, mind you. Schools that are focused primarily on memorizing the Quran, taking boys, having them sit on the floor, read the Quran over and over all day long, memorizing the verses, and memorizing also the inflammatory interpretations of the Quran that half-educated teachers are passing out as religious doctrine. They need schools that will teach them how to make a living. They need schools that will teach them how to have a set of moral and ethical values. They don't need the kind of schools they're getting, and which the government of Pakistan so far has been unable, apparently, to organize and finance. These countries in the developing world, in the Arab and Muslim world, need assistance with various efforts toward democracy. This, again, is a very tricky thing. We can't impose democracy on anybody. We have to be very careful how we teach democracy. But there are ways in which we can help those forces, those groups, those institutions within each country to improve their capabilities of dealing with the issues of rule of law, of honest and fair judiciary, of basic human rights, of free elections. There are many things we can do that could be helpful. We can do more than we've doing in encouraging cultural exchanges. We can do more than we've ever undertaken to do up to now in improving health care, which is tremendously important in many parts of the world, nowhere more urgent than in Africa, where AIDS has swept over that continent in a most unbelievable fashion, and where massive efforts have got to be made if that's to be turned around. The high water mark of American standard, American favorable acceptance in the world, I would say came in the administration of Harry Truman. It was in that period that we enunciated and carried through the program for the reconstruction of war-torn Europe. We helped Western Europe, including our defeated enemy Germany, to rebuild, to become healthy and strong again. Winston Churchill said of Truman's Marshall Plan program for Europe, "This is the most generous policy any government ever took toward other governments in the history of mankind." That may have been Churchillian hyperbole, but it was a symbol of something that was real in the feelings of people toward America. John F. Kennedy's Peace Corps was a great success. Eventually it sort of dwindled away. Thank goodness now I understand President Bush is trying very hard to revive it and strengthen and expand it. There are many ways in which we can show the generosity, the social concern and caring of the American people. I'm proud to be an American. I'm proud to be a part of this country. I believe in what we are and what we can do. I'm grateful for what God has given to us in terms of natural resources, in terms of human resources, but we need to get ourselves better organized to use those resources for the benefit of all mankind. One final word. This is not just an activity for governments. It is something that should concern all of us, whatever our walk in life may be, whatever our religious affiliation may be. One of the things that's desperately needed today is for an open, generous, mutually respecting dialogue between Christians and Jews and Muslims. This is beginning to happen. The Archbishop of Canterbury, George Carey, who incidentally is a longtime friend of mine, was with me for 3 months in Tontour when I was the head of the Ecumenical Institute there. George Carey has had a wonderful career these last 10 or 12 years now as the Archbishop of Canterbury. He just brought together a group of Jewish, Muslim, and Christian leaders in Alexandria, where they met for several days and drew up a declaration pledging themselves and their religious communities to work together for a greater measure of understanding and cooperation. Now, these are words so far. What will they mean eventually? Who knows? But at least they're pointed in the right direction. And I would say to you that all of us have a responsibility to try to be witnesses in favor of a visionary program of reaching out in dialogue, in discussion, in practical cooperation in all sorts of projects to build the ties that have been so terribly unraveled by the conflicts of recent years. The terrorism episode will not last forever. We will not defeat terrorism by super careful screening of people going into airports or trying to provide greater home security in every rural hamlet across America. That may or may not be necessary. In any case, it will not have much to do with whether we have terrorism to deal with or not. There is a way in which we can deal with terrorism by finding constructive ways to be our own country, our own free democratic society, our own devout religious believers linked to other people whom we respect, whom we want to help, and whose confidence we can win. This is the kind of opportunity we have. September 11 should have been a wake-up call, not just for greater screening against terrorists. It should be a wake-up call for a more imaginative, creative, bolder effort to build ties with the rest of the world.
Landrum has said he'll take a few questions.
One of the major sticking points in terms of coming to any Palestinian-Israeli kind of settlement relates to the right of return for Palestinian refugees. Do you think that money can be a large part of the answer there in terms of, you might say, a financial settlement to some of those who are dispossessed?
This is a very excellent question. It is true that the right of return is one of the sticking points. However, the reality is that most Palestinians understand fully that most of the Arab Palestinian refugees will never go back to the homes they had in what is now Israel. And most of them who have had a chance to go and see the situation where they once were say, oh, I could never come back here again. The neighborhood is so completely changed. They're different. I just wouldn't belong there anymore. The practical application of whatever the policy is, I think, is not impossible. What's the sticking point is an enunciation of a principle. What Arafat could not do at Camp David or any place else was to sign away all claim of the right of return for his people. And he had an article in the New York Times today of the Palestinian Plan for Peace, and one of the things he said was, our Palestinian people can't be the only people on earth who do not have a right of return to their homeland. The United Nations, the whole world has accepted the principle. The people of Timor who were driven into exile have a right to go home. The Kosovo Albanians had a right to come back to Kosovo. The Kosovo Serbs who were driven out have a right to come back, and so on and so on. You mean to tell me that we Palestinians are the only people on earth who don't have any such right? He can't sign away at least a paper right. There are several ways in which it could be handled. One is that there was a point, actually, in the early days after the State of Israel was created, in which I think it was David Ben-Gurion agreed that at least 100,000 Palestinians would be allowed to come back. He wanted to fix it on the basis of numbers. We could absorb 100,000 of them, but no more. Some people say they could be finessed by having a principle whereby those who have families still living, parts of their families still living in Israel, and there are 700,000 Israeli Arabs today who never went away. Many of them have relatives who are now in exile. Some of those might come home and families would be reunited. But you put your finger on the crucial thing. It's whatever the solution, it's going to take money. And that money has got to be very substantial, and it ought to allow the possibility of people being able to stay where they are in Jordan or Australia or Canada or wherever, or it ought to provide opportunity for people to finance themselves in moving out of these terrible camps that many of them are still stuck in and find some place to live. There would have to be negotiated with Canada, Australia, the United States, other countries, a right of so many immigrants to go. And this has been under discussion. That, I think, can be worked out. The right of return as a principle can't be just swept under the rug and abandoned altogether. The moral, ethical, political right of return has got to be somehow affirmed, but the application of it can be finessed. You can fuzz this up, and the Palestinians understand this clearly as can be, but that can be dealt with. There are still some other issues, of course, beyond that. I want to say one final word on this, though, that the most interesting thing that I encountered last week was this idea that I got both from Palestinians and Israelis, that maybe the way to make progress right now is to arrange for the almost immediate declaration of the Palestinian state. Let the Palestinian state come into being over a period of 60 days. At the end of 60 days, Israel and the rest of the world would accept the fact that the state of Israel now exists and will have democratic elections to have a democratically chosen government and will be admitted immediately to the United Nations with boundaries yet to be negotiated, yet to be determined, with the right of return also to be negotiated. But let there be created a Palestinian state immediately, so you have a state of Israel facing a state of Palestine, and not the state of Israel looking down on a subject peoples who are really occupied subjects. This will change the psychology of both sides. And interestingly enough, there are a lot of highly placed Israelis who believe this, as well as highly placed Palestinians. It may die. One of the problems is it's primarily sponsored by two men who are really not terribly popular in among their own people. One is Shimon Peres, the other is Abu Allah. Abu Allah was one of the principal organizers of the Oslo Agreement. The Oslo Agreement is a dirty word among the Palestinians today. Abu Allah is scorned by many Palestinians. Shimon Peres is a clever politician. He's probably the most distrusted politician in Israel, next to Sharon. But, I mean, he's clever, he's imaginative, he's visionary, he's worked hard in good causes, but when he should have been a shoo-in to be president of the country, the ceremonial chief of state, he couldn't get the votes even from his own party to get elected. So anything that Peres sponsors will have immediate, a lot of people say, oh, that's Peres again. The idea is probably better than the reputation of the men who sponsor it. But I found thoughtful people on both sides who said this needs to be very carefully explored, and this may come about. Another question?
Landrum, is there any possibility of ever getting a settlement with the occupation of the Palestinian territory by these settlements that are there?
Well, what's going to be done with the settlements is very tricky. The Barak proposal, and the one that Clinton modified and expanded somewhat, called for the return of, well, there are quarrels about what the percentage was, but the Israelis and Clinton claimed that Israel was offering to return 97% of the land to the Palestinians, and that would mean that a number of the settlements would have to go. And they would concentrate the settlers in a narrow band right along the borderline between Israel proper and the West Bank. Now, a few weeks ago, I had a several hours conversation briefing with one of the most interesting and ablest members of the Israeli Knesset, a woman political scientist named Naomi Kazan. Naomi was rather pessimistic about the immediate future, felt Sharon has a strong popular backing, probably couldn't be dislodged for maybe a couple of years. Nobody could tell what would happen in 2 years, but she said, we've got to get back to the peace table eventually, and we've got to deal with the settlements. And this is what she said about the solution, which surprised me, even from a dovish type as she is. I've known her for 20 years or more. She's very earnest in her convictions. She said this, an Israeli member of Knesset, as leader of the Meretz Party opposition, she's deputy speaker of the Knesset. She said there's only one solution to the settlement problem, and that is they all have to go, all of them. We never should have created any of them. We don't belong there. They have been the major barrier to peace, and we've got to get out. Now, how are you going to do it? How are you going to persuade people to do it? How are you going to get the money together to buy them out, get them out? But I think most Israelis would not buy Naomi Kazan's formula. But I think most Israelis do understand, do believe, do accept the reality that they're going to have to surrender most of those settlements. And the Palestinians will never accept any deal that's going to have them divided into 3 or 4 different enclaves, surrounded by Israeli settlements, surrounded by Israeli military-controlled roads. This is what Barak offered them. One final thing on that. You know, one of the most popular beliefs about the Camp David agreement was that the Israelis made the most generous offer that any Israeli government ever made or ever would make to the Palestinians, and Arafat turned it down. Arafat is to blame for this whole mess. I had an hour or so with Ron Pudnak, an Israeli historian who was one of the originators of the Oslo peace agreement. He was at Oslo. He was one of the principal people on the Israeli side who organized it. He said this accusation that Clinton made and Barak made over and over again, that it was all Arafat's fault, is absolutely wrong. He said the man more responsible for the breakdown of Camp David than anybody else was Ehud Barak himself. That's an Israeli who's in the middle of this process for all these years. Now, he's a dovish type, and you can dismiss him as soft-headed or whatever, but he's not a fool, and he's right in the middle of this problem. Anyway, you've got very strong views held by very strong-willed people, and nobody can tell how it's going to come out. Maybe one more question?
You're not looking over this way, so I'm going to say
sorry.
I was wondering if what familiarity you have with the Seeds of Peace organization and process where they bring Arab and Israeli youth together, and if you could speak to that a little bit.
Well, don't get me started. I'm one of the wild enthusiasts for Seeds of Peace for many reasons, partly because the executive director of it was a former student of mine here at Earlham. Bobby Rosen-Gottschalk is a wonderful human being, and her boss, the originator of Seeds for Peace, John Wallach, foreign correspondent, was a longtime friend of mine as well. And I've seen them underway. I went up to Seeds of Peace in one of their earliest camps, spent a day with them, sat through long discussions with Israeli and Palestinian students at night, and I've kept in touch with them somewhat over the years, and every week or so I get another email from Bobby about what's going on. So it's a wonderful program, and it has managed to survive all of this terrible struggle of these last painful months. They have a house in Jerusalem, which they have as the center. They publish a quarterly magazine with contributors by both Israelis and Palestinians. Some of the Palestinians, some of the Israelis have sort of drifted away and felt that the things are so tense and so difficult and so bitter that they just don't want to be associated with this group now. But a considerable number of them are still very devoted to the movement and still working to maintain those ties. It is activities like that, coming from the grassroots, coming without government sponsorship or funding, that I think offer a great deal of hope. This is partly what I was trying to say in the very last of comments of my prepared remarks. If we're going to deal with the problem of peace in the Middle East, the problem of terrorism, we've got to get grassroots organizations and groups, churches, civic organizations, educational institutions, more active in pushing these ideas. Seeds of Peace is a great symbol of what can be done and what ought to be done in greater measure than is the case yet.